like to show you a simple test that you can run for yourself that is designed to be a proof of concept for the IntelliWrite technology that you can find in Diskeeper, our data optimization product for physical computers running Microsoft Windows, and Velocity, which does a similar job for virtualized Windows systems running in VMware's vSphere or Microsoft's Hyper-V hypervisors. Many of you will have heard of Diskeeper in the past and will remember it as being a defragmenter. Well, it has evolved beyond just simple defragmentation and can now proactively optimize files as they are being written or extended in order to help maintain peak I/O performance of your underlying storage, whether you're using SAN or direct attached. Of course, it can still do a very good job of defragmenting as well, but by preventing fragmentation before it gets a chance to happen, we're dealing with the problem in the most efficient way. In the old days, file fragmentation would happen as files were being written or extended, and this would cause an extra overhead that could slow file transfer significantly for both reads and writes. You would then need to run a defragmentation tool which would waste more computing resource whilst clearing the mess up. Prevention is much better than cure, and this is where the IntelliWrite technology comes in. IntelliWrite is an advanced file system driver that leverages and improves upon modern Windows file systems' best fit file write design in order to write a file in a non-fragmented state. Put more simply, the IntelliWrite technology helps the Windows write driver take a more intelligent look at the NTFS volume when a file is written or extended in order to find a large enough area of free space to write the file without having to fragment it. It's important to note that IntelliWrite doesn't bypass Windows in any way. It's still the Windows write driver that is safely doing the write. We're just helping it to write in a more sensible way in order to minimize the fragmentation of the files, or hopefully eliminate the fragmentation altogether. Before we get on to the test, it's worth taking a moment to talk about copy-on-write solutions that can be found in many of today's SAN storage. If you're using storage technologies such as snapshots or linked clones, continuous data protection, replication or deduplication, some SAN vendors state that you shouldn't use a defragmenter. The reason for this is a sensible one. These storage technologies work at a block level and don't really understand anything about the actual files being written into the blocks. This means that if you move a file on the logical NTFS volume, the underlying blocks will typically change, even though the actual data in the file has not changed one bit. No pun intended. So a traditional defragmentation that moves files around a logical volume in order to defragment them would cause extra traffic that these underlying storage technologies would have to take into account. IntelliWrite, on the other hand, is optimizing file writes as they happen, and therefore does not cause the same problem. It's perfectly safe to run this test on any physical or virtual Windows machine running over SAN storage without having to worry about the extra traffic caused by defragmentation, because we simply won't be defragmenting anything, just demonstrating that the IntelliWrite technology does a good job of preventing fragmentation before it gets a chance to happen. There have also been some concerns about thin provisioning. Again, it's true that a traditional defragmentation can cause a thin provision volume or LUN to grow quickly as files are moved around on the logical volume in order to defragment them. This becomes more of a problem if you have over-provisioned space and told the Windows machines that they have more space to work with than there actually is in the physical storage underneath. But with the IntelliWrite technology, you are not moving files around, and the write only has to happen the one time in order for most or all of the fragmentation to be prevented. Quite simply, IntelliWrite allows you to safely optimize files as they are being written. Now, let's get on to the IntelliWrite bench with Perfmon test. This is designed to create a number of files and then extend them, much like the way users create files and then add to them, but at a much more accelerated rate. This procedure is done 3 times with IntelliWrite active, and then 3 times with IntelliWrite turned off, so you will have a pretty good comparison between how Windows will cause fragmentation to build up if left to its own devices, and the difference that having IntelliWrite will make to things like the IOPS, or number of IOs per second, the IO queue lengths, and the amount of disk idle time. Aside from showcasing the IntelliWrite technology in Diskeeper and Velocity, this can also be a good look into the future of your storage performance if you keep adding machines over the top and allow them to become more and more fragmented. The test predominantly uses Windows Performance Monitor to gather the required metrics, but also uses config.exe from Microsoft sysinternals to report on the number of fragments that the files are in after each test run. When running the test for yourself, it's important to note 3 things for good results. Number 1, try to run the test when there is little or no other activity on the underlying storage. This is especially important if you are running the test over a SAN, as other SAN activity from other machines sharing the storage could skew the results. Number 2, make sure that only IntelliWrite is active and the automatic defragmentation and space reclamation features found in Diskeeper and Velocity are turned off. Again, if these features activate during the test, it will cause extra I/O that could skew the results, and we want the test to be as accurate as possible. Number 3, make sure you have sufficient free space available for the files created during the test. If you're running the test over a single hard drive, the brief test would require about 2 gig of free space, the standard test would require about 6.5 gig, and the extensive test would require about 31 gig. If you're running the test over a SAN, the brief test would require about 6.5 gig of free space, the standard test would require 21 gig of free space, and the extensive test would require just over 100 gig. You can obtain all of the software needed to run the test for free, including a 30-day trial of Diskeeper or Velocity. All of the download links can be found in the document entitled Testing the Effects of File Fragmentation on Your SAN's Performance, and you can get that at conducive.com. Just search for IntelliWrite Bench on the site and you will find it easily. So let's go ahead and run the test so that you can see just how simple it is to do. It should take around 30 minutes to complete the brief tests on most systems, but for the purpose of this video I will speed up parts of the test where the files are being created so that the video is hopefully more watchable. Okay, so here is a Windows 2008 R2 server running in a VMware virtual environment. The storage of this is provided by an HP SAN. So let's start by obtaining the required software. I'll browse to conducive.com and locate the document with the links to the software. So let's fire up Internet Explorer. And we're going to browse to conducive.com, that's CONDUSIV. And in this search box here, I'm going to search for IntelliWrite Bench, all one word. Okay, here's the document here that we want, IntelliWrite Performance Evaluation Guide. In here you'll find the links that are very helpful in obtaining the software. Let's just scroll down a little bit. Here we go. So the first one we'll need is IntelliWrite Evaluation.zip. I'll save it to the desktop so that I can find it easily. Okay, and we'll need a copy of config.zip as well from Microsoft sysinternals. Again, I'll save that to the desktop. Okay, good. Right, let's go ahead and unpack these. And the contents of the config zip file I'm going to put into the same folder. There we go. And we can get rid of these zip files now. We don't need those any longer. So we have our folder here with the required files. Now that we have the testing files in place, all we need to do is get a copy of the Diskeeper or Velocity trialware installed. This runs for 30 days to give you a good chance to evaluate it, and as this is a virtual machine, I have chosen to download a copy of Velocity. You can quickly fill out the form at conducive.com and download the trial of either product for yourself. Remember though, Diskeeper for physical machines and Velocity for virtual machines. So let's go ahead and get Velocity installed. velocity guessed component that we'll need for this test, so I'll go ahead and choose that. I don't want automatic defragmentation or space reclamation to be active, as these features may generate extra I/O that might skew the results of the test, so I'm going to uncheck these before continuing. Right, that's velocity all installed, so let's go ahead and run the test. You'll see a batch file called IntelliWrite_evaluation.bat. You need to right click on this and select Run as Administrator. The reason for this is that you need administrator rights to stop the Diskeeper or velocity service during the test. This will render IntelliWrite inactive for the second part of the test. So, the batch file starts by explaining that testing will first be performed with IntelliWrite enabled, and then it will be disabled. As mentioned, it will create the test files 3 times with IntelliWrite turned on, and then another 3 times with it turned off. So, let's press a key to continue. This bit allows you to choose how intensive you want the test to be. Brief mode will create fewer files during the test and will be the quickest to complete, but if you really want to stress your underlying storage during the test, then standard or extensive mode will create many more files during the testing. Obviously this requires more free space and makes the test take longer, so for the purposes of this test I'll choose brief mode. Now we're being asked whether the test is being performed over a SAN or not. If you're running the test in a workstation or laptop with a single hard disk drive, then select N for this. Otherwise, if you're running the test over a SAN like we're doing here, specify Y. Now we're being asked for the drive letter of the volume that we are going to use to do the testing on. I've added volume E, which has nothing else on it, and plenty of free space to create the test files in. For the test to run properly, you must have IntelliWrite enabled. I know that this is the case because we've just installed the software, but you can verify it quickly by opening the Velocity or Diskeeper dashboard. So let's take a quick look. There, IntelliWrite's enabled, automatic defragmentation is disabled, and just over here, the automatic space reclamation is also disabled. So that is exactly as we want it. So let's close the Velocity dashboard again and return to the batch file. This note is to let you know that the script will call config.exe from Microsoft sysinternals, and if this is the first time that config.exe has been used, it will pop up a window asking you to accept their terms and conditions. So we'll agree to that. Right, so we're ready to start making the test files. There we go, there's the first test running. Once the test files are being created, you can have a look in the IntelliWrite evaluation temp folder on the selected volume and see the files being created and extended. So let's go ahead and have a look at that very quickly. There's the text documents, and you can see they're increasing in size as they're being extended, and each one of those will grow up to 40 meg in size. As mentioned earlier, the creation and then extension of these files is designed to mimic the way users use files. Files are created and then added to, but this is happening at a much more accelerated rate for the purposes of the test. Okay, let's go back to the script and keep an eye on it. I'll speed the video up here in parts so that you're not sitting for too long watching the script complete its job. On an average system, as I mentioned, the brief mode tests over a SAN would take around about 30 minutes to complete. Okay, so that's the first 3 tests completed, and now the velocity service has just been disabled, and now it's going to run those 3 file creation tests again, this time with IntelliWrite disabled, and it should take a little longer. Okay, so the test is now completed and it's time to take a look at the results. I've installed Microsoft Office on this VM for the purpose of the test, but if you don't have it installed on the machine you want to run the test on, that's not a problem. The results folder will be copied back to the location where you ran the script from, and if you copy that folder to the root of a C drive on a computer that does have Microsoft Office installed, you can easily see the results there. But we do have Microsoft Office installed on this machine, so I'll answer yes and we can take a look at the results. When you open the results for the first time, you will need to enable editing so that the Excel spreadsheet can pick the results up from the other files generated during the test. So let's go ahead and do that. If you then go ahead and save the document, you won't be asked to do that again unless you run a new test. So let's have a look at the results. The first graph here shows the amount of time it took to run the test when IntelliWrite was active and inactive. You can see that when IntelliWrite was active, the test was able to complete much more quickly because the system was dealing with much less overhead caused by the fragmentation. The next graph shows the average remaining file fragments after each test. When IntelliWrite was inactive and Windows was left to its own devices, the test files were in just over 92,000 fragments. When IntelliWrite was actively preventing fragmentation, the test files only had 648 excess fragments. That's quite a difference between those two. The third graph shows the number of split IOs occurring per second on average. A split IO happens when an IO request has to be split into smaller IOs in order to retrieve the fragments of a file. For example, an application would generate an IO to read the file, and if that file was in just one chunk, that would be fine. But if the file is in 10 fragments, that IO has to be split into 10 smaller IOs, one for each of the file's fragments. The more fragmentation you have, the more of these split IOs you will have, and therefore extra file access overhead. You can see here that the presence of IntelliWrite reduced the number of split IOs that were necessary by preventing as much of the fragmentation as possible. The next graph shows the average disk queue lengths. The longer the queue length, the longer an IO has to wait in the queue before being satisfied. You can see here that by eliminating as much fragmentation as possible when the files were being written, the queue length was much less when IntelliWrite was active. We were creating and extending quite a lot of files during the test, This graph shows the average queue length for those writes. Again, you can see that the queue length is significantly less when IntelliWrite is active, indicating that the performance drain caused by excessive fragmentation was very much reduced. The next graph shows the average number of bytes per I/O. Ideally, the more bytes you can transfer in a single I/O, the better. It is much more efficient for the system to deal with larger, more sequential I/Os rather than having to deal with lots and lots of smaller, more random I/Os. You can see here that when IntelliWrite was actively preventing the fragmentation from occurring, that's exactly what we got. A larger amount of data being transferred on average for each I/O generated. This results in the system being able to transfer more data per second than if there is heavy fragmentation, and this graph shows this. The more data the system can transfer per second, the more efficiently the storage is being used. The last graph is the amount of time that the disk could spend idle during each part of the test. You can see that by preventing the fragmentation as the test files were created and repeatedly extended, large, more sequential I/Os were generated, which were more efficient. This meant that the underlying storage had to work less hard. Ultimately, this means that the physical spindles in the SAN had to do fewer mechanical movements when IntelliWrite was active, and over time that would translate to useful things like the drives wearing out less fast, using less electricity, and requiring less cooling. Obviously, the bigger your data center, the more important that would be to you, but ultimately that's good news for the environment and your IT budget. Well, that concludes the testing. I hope that this has proven useful and would welcome you to try this test for yourselves on your systems using your underlying storage. If you think that your new SAN doesn't require you to deal with the problem of fragmentation any longer, why not test that theory? You may just be surprised by the result. Thank you again for taking the time to view this video. We are Conducive Technologies.